Let's start with this. In my opinion, the second most famous memo in the history of the Disney Company is the one that Walt sent his brother Roy just before his birthday in 1961. For a while, the brothers had been on the outs, not even speaking to each other, as the two disagreed over how they should handle the rather sizable holdings that Walt himself had accumulated through the 1950s. Because Walt Disney Productions hadn't been particularly interested in moving into the outdoor amusements business, Walt had partially developed those companies on his own. Those companies included WED, which Walt wholly owned, and Disneyland Incorporated, which Walt partially owned. But now, as Walt Disney Productions was exploring a possible theme park development in Florida, at this time, in the early 1960s, it was to be in Palm Beach Gardens, not yet Kissimmee. Roy was insistent that the majority of Walt's personal holdings be brought under the umbrella of Walt Disney Productions. Otherwise, Roy feared, stockholders would revolt as a new park created by Walt Disney Productions would create a very large cash stream that went directly to Walt through his WED design firm. This, Roy believed, would appear to stockholders as a sweetheart deal that created a significant conflict of interest between Walt Disney's private company, WED, and the publicly traded company, Walt Disney Productions, that he also oversaw, even if those private holdings were technically protected through contracts. In the late 1950s, WED had employed a few dozen artists, engineers, and architects, but now as Walt's private company ramped up to create pavilion attractions for the New York World's Fair, it was quickly growing in size, ramping up to employ a couple hundred people, and it was now housed in a complex a few miles from the studio over in Glendale. Over these issues, specifically those focused on money and creative independence, the two brothers didn't speak for months, at least not directly. Roy's lawyers spoke to Walt's lawyers and vice versa. The problems escalated to the point where it was suggested that perhaps Walt use an agent to shop his skills to another studio, which, of course, was a sign that the disagreement had gotten out of control. After that, both Walt and Roy looked for ways to de-escalate the issues. Roy reminded his staff that without Walt, none of them would have jobs at the Disney studio, as the Disney studio wouldn't exist without Walt. And Walt became open to renegotiating his contract and also renegotiating the formal relationship between WED and Walt Disney Productions. In June, just 3 days before Roy's birthday, Walt sent Roy a note in which he finally made peace with his brother. Here is that letter or memo. "Dear Roy," it began, "it's wonderful to smoke the pipe of peace with you again. The clouds that rise are beautiful. I think between us over the years, we have accomplished something. There was a time when we couldn't borrow $1,000, and now I understand we owe $24 million. But in all sincerity, happy birthday and many more, and I love you. Signed, Walt." But that right there, I would say, is only the second most famous memo in the history of the Disney Company. The more famous memo, or perhaps the more infamous memo, was written 2.5 decades later, a memo that ended up in newspapers across the country. This memo was written during the production of The Great Mouse Detective. But to understand why that memo created such a significant issue for the company, we first need to dive a little into the history of The Great Mouse Detective. That is the path that will get us going toward the most famous or infamous memo in the history of the Walt Disney Company. Let's jump in here at the beginning of Disney's development of The Great Mouse Detective. One reason that The Great Mouse Detective moved into development in the early 1980s was because of a handful of Disney artists felt that the studio's next feature, The Black Cauldron, was too large of a departure from the central identity of Disney animation. For them, Disney features were more based on humor, family-themed adventure, music, and caricature. The Black Cauldron, on the other hand, was a story that rose up out of a dark fantasy that at times, with the evil horned king and the cauldron that makes an army out of the dead, leaned a little toward horror. The solution came from writer-director Ron Clements. "Well, I've always been a big Sherlock Holmes fan," he said. He had read a book called Basil of Baker Street, in which a mouse more or less took on the role of Sherlock Holmes. Ron Miller not only wanted to make the movie, Clements said, but he also saw an opportunity to put all of these young, disgruntled people to work on an alternate project to Cauldron. The film, eventually called The Great Mouse Detective, was based on a book series called Basil of Baker Street, which essentially presented a mouse version of Sherlock Holmes. The mouse and Sherlock even lived in the same house, 221B Baker Street, with Sherlock the human upstairs and Basil the mouse down in the cellar. The authors chose the name Basil for the mouse because when the books were first published back in the 1950s, the most famous actor to play Sherlock Holmes in the movies was British actor Basil Rathbone, who continued in that role for 14 successful films between 1939 and 1946. For most of the British public, Basil Rathbone held the visual essence of the famous fictional detective. Hence, Basil was the name for the mouse detective in the books. The title Basil of Baker Street also had a poetic ring, as it contained both alliteration and assonance, making it a melodic title for a book and also probably for a movie. Disney acquired the film rights to the books, but essentially only kept the basic concept of the characters, the general setting of Victorian England, and the overall concept that a detective mouse lived downstairs from Sherlock Holmes. John Musker, another of the film's 4 eventual directors, explained, "We threw out most of what was in the books." But they also kept the name, Basil of Baker Street, which most everyone on the development team believed sounded good and was memorable. In general, early development went well for the film, far better than on The Black Cauldron. The film was enjoyable, animator Mike Peraza explained, to be part of because it all seemed to work. The story and the crew were a good matchup. The directors were all top-notch. But not everyone liked the name, including Ron Miller, who was both Walt's son-in-law and, starting in 1980, the new CEO of the Disney company. He felt the title was too British, particularly the name of Basil, which in America was pronounced basil and more often referred to an Italian herb rather than the name of a person. Then out of the blue, Mike Peraza added, the title was questioned. Management decided to test the name Basil of Baker Street to some small kids and came back to us that it wasn't working. Early in 1984, the studio had a huge hit with a live-action film called Splash. This was a romantic comedy starring Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah, directed by Ron Howard. It was specifically arranged by the studio under its brand new Touchstone division to appeal to 18 to 30-year-olds by including adult-themed humor and situations. It was described in the LA Times as mildly raunchy. In terms of box office revenue, though, it was Disney's first significant box office hit in years, taking in $70 million off of a film that cost $11 million to produce, which for Disney in the mid-1980s was a minor miracle. In the month after it opened, the Disney stock price rose by 31%, which was largely attributed to that film and to investors believing that Disney had finally found a successful path to a contemporary audience. The success of the film also helped the company triple its line of credit as it moved forward. Based on the success of Splash, Ron Miller, believing that there might possibly be some small marketing magic in single-word film titles, suggested that Basil of Baker Street also have a one-word title, specifically the title Elementary. This unusual suggestion was based on the most famous line related to the Sherlock Holmes stories, "Elementary, my dear Watson." That phrase actually is not in the original Sherlock Holmes stories. Holmes was more likely to say just elementary, or it's rather elementary. Holmes also used the phrase, my dear Watson, many times, but never with elementary. But by the early 1900s, the public had put these two lines together and created the phrase, elementary, my dear Watson, as a common, if sarcastic way of saying that one solution was rather obvious. This was the title that Ron Miller wanted to give the film. The title Elementary also solved the problem with the British name Basil. Most everyone on the production team hated the title Elementary. According to one crew member, John Musker, one of the directors hated it the most. And this is where our story of various unusual memos actually begins. Among the crew was an animator and story artist named Ed Gombert. In ways, he's the star of today's episode. Years earlier, Ed Gombert had come up through Disney's training program and had worked on Disney features starting with Robin Hood. By the early 1980s, he'd grown quietly irritated with some aspects of the company, particularly how the new Disney management was moving away from the company's roots. In response, he had taken to writing and posting or passing around fake memos, largely pointing out how animation, animators, and animation traditions at the studio, which he saw as valuable, were being pushed aside by the current management. For example, during the time that Basil was moving into production, after Disney ordered plumbing renovations to the 40-year-old animation building, thereby turning off drinking fountains, the company sent around a memo that said that water dispensers would be available on each floor, meaning that work of animators would continue inside of a minor construction zone. This, of course, would never happen in the building that housed the accountants and the lawyers, but it was the type of thing that tended to happen to artists. For this, Ed Gombert, using company stationery, created a fake memo that explained there would be other indignities that artists and others in the animation department would be forced to endure during construction. The memo said, due to the ongoing plumbing work, all restrooms in the animation building will be closed until further notice. For convenience, Andy Gumps, and these are essentially upscale porta-potties used by various studios when on location, will be placed on each floor at the end of the halls, which was obviously a joke. He posted the fake memo at the entrance to the animation building and then watched the reaction of employees as they read it on their way into the building. A look of confusion passed over the faces of many animators as they considered the distasteful possibility of placing outdoor porta-potties with all of their lingering excrement somewhere inside of the 3-story animation building. Not long after this, when Ron Miller suggested that Basil of Baker Street follow the lead of Splash and be retitled Elementary, Ed Gombert created a similar parody memo. This one suggested that other Disney animated classics be retitled with one-word slogans. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs should be retitled Dwarfs. 101 Dalmatians should simply be called Puppies. And Sleeping Beauty was given the joke moniker Smooch. Both of these memos were quickly dismissed as elaborate jokes. Ron Miller, as he was somewhat deferential to the artists, didn't insist on retitling the film and allowed the production team to keep the title Basil of Baker Street. It's possible, though, that this suggestion may have had a small influence on pre-production. Around this time, though perhaps unrelated to the title incident, Ratigan, the villain of Basil of Baker Street, was redesigned to look somewhat like Ron Miller. In the book, Professor Ratigan, despite his name, was a mouse, but on screen he needed a stronger visual presence. Ratigan started off as a very skinny little rat, animator Glenn Keane explained, but it just didn't have the power. Then at that time, Ron Miller had this big, powerful frame of a football player, and when he would walk into a room, everybody would pay attention, and I thought, that's what we've got to have with Ratigan. So I started designing him as this big, powerful rat. This was likely arranged in good fun as a way of enhancing the visual presence of the character, but it also fed into the identity divisions that were then developing between animation and management. Even at this time, all might have moved forward with Basil of Baker Street as planned if the company wasn't falling on hard times, particularly if the Disney board didn't feel it was necessary to replace Ron Miller with an executive who had more experience and clout in Hollywood, largely to fend off corporate raiders. In this environment, a number of incidents happened that would change the Basil of Baker Street project and also lead to the most famous memo in the history of the company. The first of these incidents was this. Following a power struggle which left the company vulnerable, Ron Miller and his team were replaced by Michael Eisner, Frank Wells, and their team largely from Paramount, who were even more focused on bringing Disney into the contemporary moment than had been Ron Miller with films like Splash. To oversee film production, Eisner brought in Jeffrey Katzenberg, who had worked with Eisner on a number of Paramount projects, including Ordinary People, Terms of Endearment, 48 Hours, and Star Trek: The Motion Picture. From the start, many Disney animators saw a deep thematic division between the Eisner-Katzenberg films at Paramount and with traditional Disney entertainment. They also quietly and sarcastically began referring to directions from the new management team as coming from Paramouse. Katzenberg quickly let animators know that under Eisner, Wells, and himself, Disney animation would move in a new direction. Pictures needed to be finished faster with the goal of releasing one every 18 months instead of every 3 years. When shown a recently finished Disney featurette, Mickey's Christmas Carol, Katzenberg was clearly unimpressed. After the screening, according to animator Bernie Mattison, he was quoted as saying, "I was more interested in my wife's surprise birthday party list than I was in your picture." This, too, was a signal that creative power was about to shift inside the company. From there, Eisner and Katzenberg made Disney directors re-pitch their films, even if they were already moving into production. "It was weird," director Ron Clement said. "We had worked on the Basil film for a long time. Suddenly, we had to pitch it as if it were a new idea." The project was greenlit by Eisner and Katzenberg, but still, the process, the sense that directors needed to humble themselves before the new management, left those in animation with the fear that their collective power would be far smaller moving forward than it had been in the past. Next, Eisner and Katzenberg could see that before their arrival, the previous management team had made some poor decisions, which suggested that there were also poor decisions baked into ongoing projects. In 1985, the two big animated releases in the U.S. were Disney's The Black Cauldron, with an estimated production budget of $44 million, and the Care Bears movie, with an estimated production budget of $2 million, which was less than 5% of the budget for the Disney feature. Yet, over at the box office, The Care Bears movie made more money than The Black Cauldron, bringing in nearly $23 million, a tremendous success, while The Black Cauldron brought in $21 million, a tremendous loss. It was the first large financial failure in Disney animation since another costly epic, Sleeping Beauty, had been released back in 1959. Add into this another object lesson for the new management, specifically that of the obvious value of existing Disney features. The previous year, in 1984, Pinocchio, a 44-year-old film, had been re-released and brought in over $26 million in the North American box office, which was also far more than The Black Cauldron had brought in. Following that, early in 1985, with a non-holiday release in February, Fantasia, another old classic, brought in $8 million. Along with the mandate for quicker production schedules, the Eisner team also informed animators that they would need to create features for less money. No longer could there be bloated, costly films like The Black Cauldron. Features moving forward needed to be completed for less than $10 million. I would say that the lesson to be learned from The Black Cauldron, Eisner explained, was an economic lesson. If you're going to fail, don't fail at such a high cost. Eisner also tried to contextualize his focus on cost by adding, "I'm a big believer in allowing the people that work for you to know that they can fail and it's not going to be a big problem. But if they fail without any sense of economic responsibility, I'm going to be a little upset." This edict reverberated through the animation department, where artists worried that in the future, they might end up making films in terms of visual quality not too far off from the Care Bears movie. At that time, one of the remaining 9 old men from Walt's era was Eric Larson, whose work at the company stretched all the way back to Snow White. In the mid-1980s, he helped train and mentor new animators and was particularly concerned about cost-cutting in regards to animated features. When the new management sets a schedule and such a budget, Larson said, is the animator going to have enough time to explore and study, to do research on the characters and experimental animation, time to throw away something he or she feels doesn't work and try again? Are they going to allow time for that? Walt always figured that if we had a good product, somehow or other we'll get our money. But when money is the first thing on the docket, it can only lead to mediocrity, and that's why I worry about it. With the new limits on production cost, at least in the minds of many animators, there was a clear division between the old Disney management and the new one, which made the animation department seem more like a division inside of a corporation, rather than a department that resembled the type of commercial arts collective that had existed during Walt's lifetime. But in terms of our story here, the big problem happened at the end of 1985, during the film's final year of production. By sheer coincidence, Basil at Baker Street wasn't the only Sherlock Holmes film in production in the mid-1980s. Over at Amblin Entertainment, Steven Spielberg was set to release a big-budget, high-profile film also based on the Sherlock Holmes stories, called Young Sherlock Holmes. It was positioned to be a breakout holiday hit for Amblin, but ended up receiving mediocre reviews and doing poorly at the box office. The Washington Post signaled the film's blandness by calling it a perfectly agreeable family entertainment, which likely made very few readers want to see it. In the North American market, Young Sherlock Holmes would end up as the 46th highest-grossing film of the year, doing even worse than such forgettable low-budget features as Friday the 13th, A New Beginning, and Porky's Revenge. Animator Mike Peraza recalled that Michael Eisner and other executives were concerned over the recent box office failure of Steven Spielberg's Young Sherlock Holmes and wanted to distance themselves from that film. Director Ron Clements added, when young Sherlock Holmes finally came out and didn't do that well, Eisner and Katzenberg were worried about any association with Sherlock Holmes, which meant that marketing changes were coming to Basil of Baker Street. Less than 2 months after the poor opening of Young Sherlock Holmes, Disney executives started to distance their film from the Amblin picture. In promotional designs, Sherlock Holmes' famous magnifying glass, also used in the promotion for Young Sherlock Holmes, was removed from the Disney poster. Also removed, Sherlock Holmes' famous plaid deerstalker hat. Both of these items would of course appear in the film, just not in the promotional poster. But Eisner and Katzenberg also felt that now the title needed to be changed to distance it from the Young Sherlock Holmes failure. Basil referred to the British actor who played Sherlock Holmes, and Baker Street was the location where Holmes famously lived. Unlike Ron Miller, who sent a strong suggestion that the title be changed, a suggestion that was eventually rejected, Eisner and Katzenberg insisted that the title now be changed. According to one Disney artist, Katzenberg said, remove all references to Sherlock Holmes. The audience hates Holmes. The new title, arranged almost wholly for marketing purposes, would be The Great Mouse Detective. In this, Michael Eisner was again announcing his management style, one where he focused on small details rather than on letting creative teams manage projects on their own. At the time, many Disney artists saw this as a type of pettiness, but Eisner wanted industry watchers and institutional investors to know that decisions at Disney now reflected his individual tastes and ideas, hopefully toward higher profits. At times, Eisner could get carried away in explaining how closely he managed some projects. According to Bob Iger, in one absurd instance, while being interviewed in the lobby of a new Disney hotel, Eisner started to take credit for extremely small design elements. You see those lamps over there? Eisner asked. I chose them. He also was quoted as saying, micromanaging is underrated, which in the case of Basil's new title meant that unlike Ron Miller, Eisner would be less likely to reverse a creative decision, especially one made so early in his tenure as CEO. Nearly all of the production crew hated the new title, believing it was bland, unimaginative, and in terms of its tones, rather clunky. All it did was describe, in the dullest possible terms, what the film was about. Animator Mike Gabriel explained, that's when we knew we were in trouble with the new leadership. Basil is a character you can fall in love with. The Great Mouse Detective is kind of an arrogant little idea that we didn't think was going to connect with an audience. And here is where we get to the beginning of the most famous memo in the history of the Disney Company. Again in response, Ed Gombert, subversive prankster of the story department, took to his typewriter to create another parody memo as a type of personal protest, much in the style of his previous offerings. But this time, he created the memo as though it came from the desk of the recently hired head of animation, Peter Schneider. Unlike most executives at Disney, Schneider hadn't come up through the ranks at Disney or at other film studios. His background was in live theater, a person who had also worked with the 1984 Olympic Arts Festival in Los Angeles. From that experience, he had been recommended to Disney as he had a history in narrative collaboration and large projects, though nearly all of that existed outside of film production. Many animators at the time saw Schneider as an outsider, even more so than Michael Eisner or Jeffrey Katzenberg, who at least were film people. Using Peter Schneider as the supposed author, Gombert wrote a memo addressed to the entire animation department dated February 13, 1986, where he poked fun of what he believed was the short-sightedness of Eisner, Katzenberg, Schneider, and others. Along with the new title for Basil of Baker Street, Gombert wrote in his parody memo, "It has been decided to rename the entire library of animated classics." And then, one by one, Gombert created didactic, bland titles for 18 Disney classics. Snow White was changed to Seven Little Men Help a Girl. Pinocchio became The Wooden Boy Who Became Real. Fantasia, Color and Music. Dumbo, The Wonderful Elephant Who Could Really Fly. Bambi, The Little Deer Who Grew Up. Cinderella, The Girl with the See-Through Shoes. Alice in Wonderland, The Girl in the Imaginary World, and so on. He did leave just one film title unchanged, suggesting that its title was already bland. That film was The Aristocats. The memo initially was passed around to what has been described as a few chosen within the animation department. It was likely intended as another joke, a way of secretly speaking truth to power and pointing out that the new managers, at least in the opinions of some, were sort of morons. And this memo, like those that preceded it, might have simply been a mild curiosity, something that garnered a few chuckles and then was forgotten. Except this memo didn't stay as intended in the animation department. It quickly made its way around the company. John Musker, one of the directors, not caring for the film's new title, put a copy of the memo in an envelope and sent it anonymously through internal mail to Jeffrey Katzenberg. But in reading that memo, Musker had missed one important detail. This memo wasn't simply some anonymous bit of intellectual vandalism. In the line of authorship, the memo had been jokingly attributed to Peter Schneider. That envelope that Musker used, however, held no trace of who had actually sent it. When Katzenberg received the memo, he reportedly called in Schneider yelling, "What's going on? What are your people doing?" Schneider had no idea about the memo, not until Katzenberg showed it to him. One longtime Disney assistant director whose work at Disney went back to the early 1950s took Schneider aside to explain that this was essentially how animators, or really most any group of artists, let off steam through a series of jokes and pranks. But Schneider, a new hire who had just been dressed down by his supervisor, wasn't placated. Instead, he called a division-wide meeting with those who were still working on or who had worked on the film. By February, most of the film's production team was finished, and those artists were moving on to new projects. The meeting took place in a screening room. "Oh, I remember that meeting in the theater," one artist recalled. "Boy, was Schneider livid. He let loose a string of expletives, and the entire audience gasped. I think it was probably the first time many of the Disney personnel were introduced to true Hollywoodese in such a public forum. Several of the artists that had never worked anywhere but Disney looked as if they had taken a wrong turn and stepped into hell. The anger in the room was palpable. Peter Schneider was incensed, Director Ron Clement said. Executives want to fire whoever wrote that memo. Schneider insisted that he be told who had written the memo. But animators were unified in protecting Gombert. No one on the crew was going to rat out the culprit, Mike Peraza said, although we all knew the author. For a time, the issue with that memo died down, but the story didn't end there. Steve Hewlett, A recently laid-off writer who had worked on The Fox and the Hound, The Black Cauldron, and The Great Mouse Detective received a copy of the memo from his wife, as by this point it was being widely and quietly passed around the studio. "Still smarting from my layoff," Hewlett explained, "I made a quick decision to send a copy of it to the LA Times, along with a detailed and anonymous explanation of what it was. The missus argued vehemently that I should mind my own business, but I ignored her. I popped a letter and memo into the nearest postbox and waited." Nothing happened immediately, but at least one reporter at the LA Times was aware of the memo and took an interest in it. 3 days before The Great Mouse Detective opened in theaters, the LA Times, in its calendar section, ran a story about the memo. The article was titled, "Mouse Chivious Memo Upsets Big Cheese." According to a little bird, the article began, "The brass at Disney decided that the title might suffer from the same problem that sank Steven Spielberg's young Sherlock Holmes. Too British for American kids. The animators think the new title is as imaginative as retitling Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs as Seven Little Men Help a Girl. In fact, one day in February, a memo, the impertinent memo, appeared on the animation department bulletin board announcing that the studio had renamed all of its animated classics. The memo provoked merriment among artists, the little bird has told us, but the department chief wasn't amused. The unnamed author of the LA Times article reached out to Robert Levin, head of Disney marketing, who confirmed that all of this had happened and then offered a quote. "Basil was a film they had been working on for a long period of time," Levin said. "For us to come in late in the process and say, 'We want to change this thing you've been working on,' was difficult to take. We have all agreed that on future releases, we'll work closely together earlier." The Times article, in a sidebar, also included all of the alternate names proposed for earlier Disney animated features. The article was then reprinted in other papers across the country, including a few that made a game out of the renamed films. In a boxed sidebar, various papers asked readers to match the clever new names from List A with the actual names of the feature from List B. The article proved to be an embarrassment for Disney management and likely didn't encourage public confidence in the film that was about to appear in theaters. Despite the small controversy, The Great Mouse Detective did reasonably well at the box office. It was nowhere near as successful as Splash, but it was successful. The film didn't quite make Eisner's edict of costing less than $10 million, but it came pretty close. According to the New York Times, it cost $12.8 million. One of the film's directors, Ron Clements, understood what was really riding on this project. "If The Great Mouse Detective is successful," he said, "management may be a little more reassured." On its initial release, the film took in over $25 million, which meant that, even with marketing costs, it produced a profit. But rather oddly, the trouble with that sarcastic memo didn't end with the film's release. It circulated through various regional papers, where it was seen by thousands and thousands. A staff writer for the TV show Jeopardy saw one of these articles and then developed a whole Jeopardy category around the fake film titles. On Thursday, January 1st, 1987, this Disney-related category appeared on Jeopardy, a category called In Other Words. Standing before the cameras, the show's host, Alec Trebek, explained, "A few words of explanation, if I may, about this last category. In Other Words came as a result of a big foo-foo that occurred at the Disney studio last year, when the employees staged a minor revolt when they changed the title of Basil of Baker Street to The Great Mouse Detective, and they sent out a memo, tongue-in-cheek, very much so, about what would happen if they changed the titles of all the other great Disney films. So, in other words, We'll give you an answer, and you have to come up with the title of the Disney film as we know it. The $100 answer was Seven Men Help a Girl, to which the correct question was, what is Snow White? Which led slowly up to the $500 answer, which was The Amazing Flying Children, to which the correct question was, what is Peter Pan? But despite the memo and all of the public fallout from it, Disney Animation was now on the upswing, with the bad taste of the Black Cauldron and its poor showing at the box office having been washed away by The Great Mouse Detective. The next feature was Oliver and Company, a retelling of the Oliver Twist story. This was a project Eisner and Katzenberg managed from the start, one more focused on star power and pop music than any previous Disney animated feature. In the new vocabulary of the animation department, Oliver and Company took Disney animation in the direction of para-mouse, something that relied on star power to sell a film. Eisner said Jeffrey managed to convince pop stars, ranging from Billy Joel to Bette Midler, to serve as the voices of the main characters. According to him, with the film's box office stake of $53 million, Oliver and Company provided the first clear evidence that animation had the potential to become a highly profitable business once again. But the real transformation wouldn't happen until Disney released The Little Mermaid, which consciously reimagined Disney animation through the lens of a Broadway musical. But Disney executives, by this point, had also learned from the managerial skirmishes on The Great Mouse Detective. Moving forward, at least for a little while, the Disney company tended to use titles associated with the original works, such as The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and so on, for animated features that it released. A plan that allowed audiences to easily recognize stories, a plan that also likely contributed in some small way to Disney Animation's ongoing success at the box office. And as for Ed Gombert, he continued to work on Disney projects for years, including Rescuers Down Under, DuckTales, Tarzan, The Lion King, Pocahontas, and many others. And later, after his Disney career was over, he worked on The Croods and the Kung Fu Panda series. In animation circles even today, he remains somewhat famous for having penned that memo nearly 4 decades ago. The memo that remains the most famous or infamous in the history of the Disney Company. I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode, likely one more entry into our Strange Stories series this summer. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you will find well over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.